3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. Gandalf paused and then said slowly in a deep voice, "This is the Master Ring, the one ring to rule them all. This is the one ring that he lost many ages ago to the great weakening of his power. He greatly desires it, but he must not get it." Frodo sat silent and motionless. Fear seemed to stretch out a vast hand, like a dark cloud rising in the east and looming up to engulf him.
One of the great scenes at the beginning of Lord of the Rings, here Gandalf is telling Frodo that the ring they found is indeed the one true ring. We are back with our Tolkien series in the new year, and I'm joined by Terry Fakes. We're halfway through our Tolkien series here, and the plot is really picking up. The plot of Tolkien's life has really picked up, and we're going to get to the point today where we see him create the Lord of the Rings. One thing I've noticed as we move through this series is you can't help but compare Tolkien and Lewis's lives together. And both
Mhm.
of them ended up writing their masterpieces relatively late in their life. They were not early. The ideas were early for Tolkien, but the writing itself was pretty late. Both of them were, in some sense, late bloomers. And boy, it paid off in the end, but it's very countercultural to the way that we see artistic creativity, genius today.
It is, although I'm reminded of several people like that today. You think about Ian McGilchrist, think about Tim Keller. Keller didn't begin writing. I know it sounds like we think he's been writing forever, but he didn't begin until much later in his life. And for him, he said that was intentional. He felt like he needed to live some life and test the truth of what he knew before he began to write. But you're right, it does go against our cultural current right now.
I think for Tolkien, one of the big things is a lot of things happened to him early in life that shaped
Hmm.
what he would go on to write later. As we've seen in these both of these series, Lewis and Tolkien were writing out of the experiences they had, and Tolkien certainly is writing out of the experience he had in World War II, and again looking forward into and writing during or in World War One, and then again in World War II. These
Hmm.
wars, the quest of Western civilization against an enemy, is the theme we're going to focus on today. And if we pick up Tolkien's story, he has been injured in World War One, as you remember, probably in a miraculous way. His trench fever saves his life.
Hmm.
His group that he was in suffered some pretty heavy casualties at the Battle of the Somme. He gets trench fever. He's sent back to convalesce and recover. And he's there for a long time, actually. He's only in combat. He's only on the front lines for about 6 months, but he's in the service for 4 years. So he goes back, he's recovering. And by the end, when he finally gets discharged, it's July 15th of 1919, 4 years almost exactly after when he joined. But the last year or so of his service, he was looking for what to do next. In fact, by this time, he was married. He'd had their first child in 1917. He'd been injured. Two of his best friends from the TCBS had been killed. His
Hmm.
other friend that we'll come back to later, they'd been a little bit estranged. He was really alone. The world for Tolkien before the war and the world for Tolkien after the war were completely different.
Right.
He's trying in 1918 to secure a position at Oxford. He wants to go back to Oxford. He's graduated. He wants to teach there, and he makes a trip there in 1918, but he gets turned down for every position that he's applying for. So he has a chance meeting with one of his old professors, a guy named William Alexander Craigie, who had tutored him in Old Norse when he was at Oxford. If you remember from the first episode, this is kind of the passion that he had had since he was a kid was these old languages. He went to Oxford as a classics major studying Greek and Latin,
Hmm.
but he really found his stride when he got into Old English, Old Norse, Icelandic. And he has a meeting with Craigie, who has become, at this point, it has been for about 20 years, one of the lead editors on the Oxford English Dictionary. And he enlists Tolkien to join the team that's currently working on the letter W. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary is not your Merriam-Webster's dictionary. It's not just here's the word, here's the definitions. If you've never looked at the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary before, it is a wonderful, amazing resource. In fact, the further you go, we'll talk about it a little bit, but the further you dive into this, the more incredible it is that people produced this. It's what they're
Right.
trying to do, unlike a regular dictionary that's trying to furnish you with kind of the usable meaning of a word. The
Hmm.
Oxford English Dictionary is trying to trace the history, the etymology of the word, and they are cataloging the first instances of the word in literature. So as you can imagine, you're trying to figure out for all kinds of words, you're trying to figure out when's the first time this word was used in literature and what has it meant since then all the way down to what it means now. What are its roots? Where did it come from? What source language did it come from? And these guys in the late 19th century and the early 20th century are tracking these references down by hand and by memory. Okay, this would be hard to
Right.
do even with a search engine, but they're doing this by hand. And this is a little digression here, but I thought this was such a fascinating project. There's a great book called The Professor and the Madman. It's also a movie. The movie's really good about
Hmm.
the origins. This is kind of the generation before Tolkien working on the Oxford English Dictionary. And so you have this editor, the guy that really gets it off the ground, named James Murray, who in the movie is played by Mel Gibson. And he decides that there's no way a team of scholars is going to be able to pull this off all by themselves. So they do what is really the first crowdsourcing
Hmm.
project. They decide that they're going to let people look all this stuff up and send in these slips on different words from references, from use, all of this, and they're going to send these in. And people across England kind of see this as a fun pastime. Kind of like, when you read through something, you find a word, you think maybe this is the first time it's ever been used. You start checking it. Anyway, there's amateur lexicographers are sending in all these words to the team. And what they realize is they're getting all these words from this one guy. In fact, they get over 10,000 entries from this guy, Dr. W.C. Minor. And after they released the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, Murray is concerned with making sure that all these people get honored for their contributions. And knowing that this one person contributed a huge portion of the entries, he wants to honor this person. And so he's written with him back and forth for 20 years, but he's never met him. So he writes to him and says, can you come in? He says, no, health, I'm traveling, and he has all these excuses. So finally, Murray says, well, I'm going to come visit you. Send me an address. So he sends him his address and he makes the trip out there. And when he gets there, he discovers that the address leads to the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum.
Right.
So Murray goes in. He thinks he requests a meeting with the warden, the overseer of this facility, and just addresses him as if he's Dr. Minor. And the guy kind of politely says, "Oh, I'm actually not the person you're looking for. The person you're looking for is an inmate here. He's one of our patients." So he gets to meet him, and the movie actually portrays this really well. It's this kind of eerie scene. Dr. Minor's played by William Penn or Sean Penn, and
Hmm.
they're kind of on edge with each other because it turns out that William Minor had been convicted of murder. He had gone crazy. He had seen these hallucinations. He had murdered an innocent person, and then he had gotten off on reason of insanity, and he'd been sentenced basically to live the rest of his life in this facility. And in the movie is great because it shows the struggle that he goes through, and he finds his meaning in searching for these words, and you get to see the nuts and bolts of how this dictionary was made, and it's truly, truly incredible. Um, and the meticulous scholarship that was necessary to do this is amazing. In the following era, so they put out the Oxford English Dictionary and they realized they've only scratched the surface on the words that they could do. They get a first edition together, but then they realize this is going to be a multi-volume big project. So they
Hmm.
start finding these young linguists, lexicographers, people that study the origins of words, and they put these teams together. They get great funding. sells really well. And people like Tolkien would spend a portion of their life researching these words. And when Tolkien joins the project, they're working on the letter W. And so Tolkien, and actually you can see this today in an edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, Tolkien is responsible for research on words like waggle. That was the first word that he did, was trying to figure out a definition for the word waggle, trying to find out when that was
Hmm.
first used. Walnut, want, wake robin, warlock, and walrus, among others. In fact, walrus turned out to be one of the most difficult for him to track down the lineage and the use of the word over time. But the thing that's so significant about this is this was his first career after World War One. This was what he spent his
Hmm.
time doing. He wasn't paid well, but he was paid enough to make a living. He was working, he was finding fulfillment in this. But maybe even more importantly for our story, in his work on all these languages, reading back through these ancient books and trying to figure out how words are used and how they change over time, his imagination was so inspired by this that at night, when he wasn't working on English, he was working on his languages that would later come into being in The Lord of the Rings. So in this season in particular, he was working on the Kenya language, which is the primary language of the elves in The Lord of the Rings. So you can just see him. He's so immersed in what he's doing. He's obsessed with language. He always has been. And in his research of real life words, he's spending his evening hours, he's moonlighting by creating these fantasy words and languages that will go on to create the kind of the web, if you will, of the Lord of the Rings.
It's really pretty amazing. First of all, how much he knew and had read in ancient languages, which, would inform a great deal of his work with the dictionary. But then that he didn't, that was not enough. It's not enough to look back at Old English and Icelandic and Nordic and all of that and work out the etymology of these words. It's like, well, I think I'll play with another language. I'm going to create an Elvish
Yeah.
language. And he does. And the extent to which he does that is amazing. I mean, if when you read the Lord of the Rings and you see the languages there, there is so much effort put into them. It's not a matter of I'm writing this novel and I just kind of need a made up language. He started with the languages before he ever
Hmm.
got to the novel, uh, which is pretty amazing. One interesting word, I don't know if he worked on this word in the Oxford English Dictionary, but the word wraith, Wraith. It's in the
Hmm.
W's, so he may very well have, but it figures heavily, as you know, in the Lord of the Rings, because you have the ring wraiths, these
Hmm.
not quite alive, not quite dead kings of men who've been taken over by the rings.
Yeah, that's a cool connection because a lot of people think that that word is the best way to describe evil in the Lord of the
Mm.
Rings. We talked
Hmm.
a bit about evil in the last episode, but that evil is something that is corrupting. It's not, 100% evil, 100% good, but the process of the way evil works in the world is through this corruption. You see these wraiths that used to be good and they're undead, but they're being continuously corrupted. And
Right.
that's a great insight into Tolkien, that word is the one he used. And maybe that is one of the ones that he worked on, or at least he was in that similar vein,
Hmm.
working on that team in the Oxford English Dictionary. I think the other interesting point for the development of the Lord of the Rings and his life later on is when you look at what Tolkien was doing, he was somebody who believed in doing something because it was worth doing.
Hmm.
I don't think he ever thought that his work would be kind of the banner on the Oxford English Dictionary. He wasn't a main editor. He wasn't a person of note really working for it. I think he wanted to do it, one, because he needed a job, but two, he enjoyed the work because it was interesting in and of itself. And
Right.
this is an insight into Tolkien's personality. And what will end up being a major theme in the book is there are a lot of things that are just worth doing. They're good. They're worth spending your time on, no matter what the effects are. I think one of the things you could say about Tolkien is he was not a pragmatist. He
Hmm.
did not do things just because they would eventually bring about a great outcome. He did them because they were essentially good or worthwhile or enjoyable in and of themselves. And I'll put a pin in that because we'll come back to it. The whole plot of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit essentially revolve around this point. These are
Hmm.
not pragmatic books. These are these books have a vision of right and wrong that drives the characters to do what they do. So he's working there, but he's realizing that as he's having more kids, this is not exactly paying the bills the way that he needs.
Right.
So he's looking around for academic positions. I think probably at heart he knew that he would be a great teacher at some point. That was his calling. And in 1920, he lands a teaching post at the University of Leeds. This was a big breakthrough for him because even to get into the guild academically was a big step.
Hmm.
So he gets there. He gets to be a part of a great English department. He's teaching English, and by that they don't mean just Comp 1 and Comp 2 like you have
Right.
today. They mean the history of English, English language. He's teaching Middle English, Old English, all the great works of literature in the English language. And he has a great mentor there. He has some great colleagues there. That's where you see him learn what it's like to teach,
Right.
how to manage your teaching load. But two, and we saw this in the Lewis series, this is probably where Tolkien learns how to be on a university staff, how to be on the committees, how to play politics, how to get selections. This is something that Tolkien was always pretty good at, and C.S. Lewis was always pretty bad at.
Pretty bad. Right.
Lewis could not figure out how to play the politics. Tolkien was always pretty good about this. In fact, Tolkien gets him that job. He's part of the
Uh-huh.
recommendation team for that job later in life. And because of this, I think Tolkien's career, his teaching career, matures much faster than C.S. Lewis's does. He
Hmm.
teaches for about 5 years at the University of Leeds, and in 1925, his mentor, this William Craigie again, retires from his post at the University of Oxford, which is called the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professorship of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford. It's a pretty prestigious post to be holding. He's retiring with his mentor's help from the University of Leeds, who actually also has gone on to Oxford to teach. He's recommended extremely highly for this position. He gets it. He arrives in Oxford in 1925, and he will stay there for the rest of his working life. He will work in this position for 20 years, and in 1945, he will become the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature, also at Oxford, but in a different college. He moves from
Hmm.
Pembroke to Merton. And these are both very prestigious positions. They're well paid, the good teaching load, great opportunity to influence students and faculty in the University of Oxford. So he's landed pretty much his job. I mean, this is what he wanted. He's where he needs to be. He's able to teach Beowulf. He's able to talk about the things that he loves. And of course, he's able to read and write on the side, which is the big thing. In fact, it's during this season of his life, this first professorship, that he writes The Hobbit, much of Lord of the Rings, his translation of Beowulf, many of his essays that people still read today were all done when he was in this professorship at Oxford. This was a defining moment for him in his career and for his work. And at this point, there had to be a sense that he had kind of arrived. He had landed where he wanted
Hmm.
to be. He had recovered from the war. If you think this is, 6 years after he's been discharged from the service, he's finally landed on his feet at Oxford. But there's one thing really missing for Tolkien. We've been tracing this theme probably, I don't know, would you say the most significant thing in Tolkien's life, even more than his love of scholarship and knowledge and all of his literary pursuits, is his pursuit of friendship.
Yes, I think that idea of in his case, male friendships, deep male friendships, is something we've talked about before that our world has lost to our detriment. But it's something that really shaped who he was, being, an orphan. Then he finds the TCBS, that small group of guys, comes through World War One, and as you said, two of them died, and then he's estranged from the fourth. And it's not really until he gets into this next phase of his life at Oxford that he begins to attempt to reassemble that. He begins joining a lot of clubs. He begins starting a lot of clubs. And I think it's probably 1926 or so, after he's been at Oxford a year or so, that he meets C.S. Lewis in one of these clubs. And therein begins a friendship, but a friendship that'll expand into what most famously is known as the Inklings later on. But he is on a quest in his life to regain something that he's lost, that the war has stolen from him, and that is that friendship and that support.
He seems to have this gravitational pull towards building these groups, these friendships.
Hmm.
Some of it has to have been his childhood. You have to think that there's a maybe a psychological piece of this that he's always looking for kind of his family beyond his family. He,
Hmm.
you know, I think the experience of many of these guys that went to boarding school at a fairly young age, this was how they survived, was with these strong male friendships, these groups. But Tolkien seems even be above and beyond others that you read about in this period in his longing to get these little communities together, these fellowships. Like we said, this is maybe the theme of his life that comes out really strongly in his writing, that there are these little groups, these little fellowships of people together who have a common purpose and a common friendship. And this is the time, 1926 is the time that he meets C.S. Lewis. They meet each other in a very quintessentially Oxford way. They both join this group called the Coalbiters, who read and translate old Icelandic myths. You can't think that there's that many people in the world who are doing that.
I would suggest that he would have had more success if he started organizations to do something other than translate Icelandic myths. But
Yeah.
those are the kinds of people that Tolkien was close to.
Well, you have to think if people show up for this, you're going to be fairly like-minded. I mean, this weeds out most of the
Exactly.
others, I think. So their friendship slowly grows, even to the point that Tolkien is so instrumental in Lewis's conversion. They're on that walk on Addison's Walk, and they're talking about
Hmm.
the true myth. I mean, they have this shared love for literature and mythology. And though Tolkien is a Catholic and C.S. Lewis becomes an Anglican, they share this common faith. And what's really interesting is Lewis is almost made for Tolkien in certain ways because he is so different. But John Garth, who's written the great book Tolkien and the Great War, puts it really well. Indeed, Lewis rolled into one forceful personality their several roles, talking about the TCBS, the
Hmm.
generous social gifts of Rob Gilson, the critical insight of Christopher Wiseman, and most importantly, the passionate, imaginative sympathies of G.B. Smith. So, in some ways, you have the TCBS, those three that are rolled
Hmm.
into one with Lewis. And then, of course, later on, you get all the Inklings who are playing a similar role in Tolkien's life. Tolkien attributed a lot in life to Lewis's influence on him. When we come up to his writings, we see that Lewis was the one that really encouraged him. These are good. They need to be published. Tolkien had read a couple of things at some essay clubs, but mostly he read it with the small group of people that he'd cultivated. And Lewis was the one that really drove him to publish and to work these things out and actually finish them, which was always a difficulty for Tolkien. You've got to
Right.
finish this. You've got to do your best. And Tolkien would say later in a letter, only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. So we can owe the publication of Tolkien's best stuff to his friendship with Lewis.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And you've kind of laid the groundwork here for two great themes that we wanted to talk about here. And then the first one comes out of what you've been talking about, and this idea of the quest. This quest idea, this groups, these small groups, whether it's the Hobbit or the Lord of the Ring, figure prominently in this story, this myth of these like-minded individuals getting together to do what's right. And they're not even alike. They just happen to be both all committed to the quest. So you get this idea of the quest. And then the second is, I think, informed by, in my opinion, a lot by World War II and what he had been through. And that is the idea of power, good and evil. You put it this way, which I think is really interesting. The quest is central to it, but the ring is actually a character in the Lord of the Rings. And where the quest talks about this friendship and doing the right thing and coming together to pursue something, the ring highlights Tolkien's ideas about good and evil, power, those kinds of subjects, which, the whole world saw firsthand during World War II.
Hmm. Yeah, the idea of a quest, it seemed simple at first. Of course it's a quest. There's a quest in every, piece of literature, but there isn't. There isn't a well-defined quest in all of our books and media and entertainment like there is in The Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are both 100% oriented around a single quest that must be completed.
Hmm.
In The Hobbit, you get these dwarves that have come together. They've got to go back to the mountain that's been taken over by this dragon, take back the mountain, get the Arkenstone. In Lord of the Rings, they have this ring that they discover and they've got to destroy it. So, in that sense, the plot of these books is unbelievably simple. In fact, I was reading back through Tom Shippey, who's a great Tolkien scholar. In his book, Tolkien, the Author of the Century, he points out that the Lord of the Rings is infamously difficult to plot because there's so many divergent
Right.
details. All these things happening. Three or four pages go by and you're describing this tree or this glen or
Hmm.
something that they're in. You're
Hmm.
thinking to yourself, this is the most slow moving book, in certain parts of it. But actually, what he points out is the plot of the Lord of the Rings is extremely simple and pervasive. It's very singular. It never changes throughout the book. Chapter two of book two. So if you've read the Lord of the Rings, as opposed to seeing the movies, the movies are in three pieces. The Lord of the Rings is in three pieces, but in those three books, and I use that in quotes because the whole thing is really one big book, you have two
Hmm.
halves. And so you actually have six parts of the Lord of the Rings. And
Right.
so in book two, which would be the second half of the first section, if we're going to get our terminology
Well, the published
right,
book, The Fellowship of the
the
Ring, that
Fellowship of the Ring
volume
has
would
book one
have
and
book
book
one and
two.
book two. Right.
Book two of that, chapter two, is called The Council of Elrond. And I've mentioned before, I think it's probably the best. I think it's the best single chapter. Although the Battle of Pelennor Fields is pretty great. There's a lot of good ones, but early in the series, this is the best chapter. It's actually the longest chapter in The Lord of the Rings. It's twice as long as the average. It's over 16,000 words. Um, I think in print it's about 150 pages. I mean, it's almost a book in and of itself.
Hmm.
But in the Council of Elrond, you get the theme, you get the plot of what they're going to do, and it's very simple. Can we determine whether or not this is the one true ring? Is this actually it? And Gandalf has
Hmm.
been looking at this. He's gone to the Library of Minas Tirith, which is a great scene only in the director's cut, where they show him at the Library of Minas Tirith. What should we do with it? If it is the one true ring, what should we do with it? And third, who's going to do it?
Right.
And this is portrayed really well in the movie, but it's even better in the book where they spend, an hour talking about the history of the ring. This is it. What should we do about it? And they almost keep coming back to, Elrond at one point says it, Gandalf says it. They keep coming, okay, okay, okay. What should we do about this? What can we do about the ring? If we have it, what should we do about it? And then who should do it? And of course, that Frodo becomes the ring bearer. He's the one that volunteers to take the ring to Mount Doom to destroy it.
Hmm.
But this simple plot device is the story. Take the
Right.
ring, destroy it at Mount Doom. And this rises out of Tolkien's experience in the war. There's a pretty easy plot line in the war. World War I was insanely complicated getting into the war, but it wasn't that complicated to get out of the war. The enemy must be defeated. That's
Right.
it. However you got to do it, that's what needs to be done.
Hmm.
And I think this also arises out of his faith. If you think about it, the Bible also has a very simple plot line with a lot of complex
Right.
subplots. Sin must be atoned for. Is this sin deadly? Yes, it is. What should we do about it? It's got to be atoned for. Well, who's going to do it? I mean, it's the basic plot of the Bible that's
Right.
seen in the Lord of the Rings. And that's where we talk about, is the Lord of the Rings an allegory for the biblical story? It's not an allegory, but it is thematically linked to the biblical story.
Very heavily
And
informed.
when you think about this quest, every human being is on a quest. Jesus has the quest. Jesus has done the quest. He has, and
Hmm.
and it's funny because you set off, from Rivendell on Christmas Day. They destroy the ring on Good Friday. There's a lot of parallels here to the story of
Hmm.
Christ. But in the overarching vision of the book, the quest is exactly the same. And in some ways, this is Tolkien's deep-seated Christian worldview coming out that the world is a quest. It has been completed by Christ, and now we are participating in that quest as Christians.
And you know,
And
one thing, Cole, that struck me about the Council of Elrond, uh, the last time I read it, I just didn't pick up, I didn't really pay attention to this before, but it really ties in with what you're saying. When Elrond commissions the people that are going to go on the quest, the Fellowship of the Ring, he, Frodo's committed all the way to the end to take the ring to Mount Doom and destroy it. But most of the other people are only committed for a certain part. It says these you would agree to take him to this far, and beyond that is left up to you.
mhm,
And so one of the really powerful ideas is you do see the fellowship split up and go different directions, but always comes back together. And in the end, it's not a mandate that holds them together. It's their commitment to the cause and their loyalty to one another. And I just think there are interesting parallels to our lives out of that as well.
mhm.
Again, not everybody was committed to the whole quest, and yet they all saw it through.
That's the parallel to Tolkien's life, I think is really fascinating. There, for some of the characters in the Lord of the Rings, there is a pragmatic end. You think of
Hmm.
Aragorn. When the ring is destroyed, he is unveiled as the heir of the kingdoms of men, and so he is the High King of Gondor. He becomes something because of this quest. But others actually, they either don't become something or they're diminished by the quest. You think of Gandalf.
Hmm.
What does Gandalf really have to gain through the quest? He could leave Middle Earth. His purpose was to be there to help the people of Middle Earth against Sauron, but he could leave Middle Earth and be fine personally. And instead, he passes through the battle with the Balrog. He passes through many trials. He fights many battles because he believes in destroying the ring. And there's a lot of characters that way as well.
Well, one of my favorite lines, little scenes in Lord of the Rings, is echoes what you're saying. This is Frodo talking to Gandalf, and Frodo knows that he has. This is in chapter 2. So he has to carry it, and he says, "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." Because I
Hmm.
think the ultimate character who had nothing pragmatic to gain are the hobbits. It's
Right.
Frodo. I mean, if you think about it, he's the primary, he's the ring bearer. He's the one that bears it, and he has no pragmatic goal. All he ever really wants to do is go back to the Shire and live
Hmm.
peacefully. So and I wonder how many, Cole, that describes all of the soldiers in general, but English soldiers who were caught up in World War II. Would
Hmm.
they not have said those exact words? Is that I wish it not had not happened in my time. I have no interest in this. I just want to live a peaceful life.
Right.
It seems like there are very powerful parallels there in Tolkien's life.
Yeah, and Frodo is one of those characters who is diminished by the quest. You know,
Hmm.
when he's stabbed, he never really recovers. You know, he sees things, he has nightmares,
Right.
he's changed forever by the quest. And as you pointed out, he probably has the least to gain from destroying the ring. The Shire is not really threatened. They're on the outskirts of the world. All he wants to do is go home. Sam is the same way. You know, Sam that comes along and he just wants to go home and marry the local girl and have a family. And but they undertake this quest because it's the right thing to do, and they're
Right.
courageous people. And courageous people step up when there's something that needs to be done. And they are the ones that end up completing it, I think, for those reasons. It's the characters like Boromir, for example, or like Saruman, who are corrupted by the quest because they have something to gain from it. They're the ones
Hmm.
that are opportunistic about it and they want to exploit the quest or they want to exploit the ring for themselves, who end up being destroyed by it. Whereas Frodo and Sam and Pippin and Merry and Gandalf and Legolas and Gimli, the ones that don't necessarily have anything evident to gain are the ones who stay true to who they are and they complete
Hmm.
the quest in the end. Which that kind of leads us to the second thing that you mentioned, and that is the ring itself. So if the whole plot is you got to destroy this ring, What's so special about this ring? Why destroy the ring?
Yeah, it's really interesting as we read in the opening verse is this ring is the key to all the other rings that were given to the elves and the dwarves and the men, the kings, and they were deceived by it because the One Ring ruled them all, and it was Sauron's way of world domination, if you will, taking advantage of their love of power and their love and the goals they wanted, and he deceived them and then overcame them. But the interesting thing about the ring is there's a lot to be said in Lord of the Rings about the idea of power and the corruption of power. But you summarized it this way, is that the ring is immensely powerful. It is the One Ring, that it will corrupt whoever uses it. And we can talk about the people that are corrupted in the story and the people that knew they would be corrupted. But then, thirdly, it really can't be used and it can't forever be hidden because it has a will of its own. It actually has to be destroyed.
This is where I think when you dive back into Tolkien's sources, why a ring? What significance is a ring? When you go back into the Norse and Germanic myths that Tolkien loved so much, magic rings were kind of commonplace. You would have these rings that have certain powers. The easiest one to think about in the Lord of the Rings is when you put the ring on, you turn invisible. This is
Hmm.
this is pretty common in these myths, is you would have a ring that would give you some kind of power. And that's what the other rings are. So there's protection from the other rings. There's
Hmm.
strength and wisdom and insight that comes from these other rings. But the one true ring is really the master of all. It's a infinite power kind of ring. And in the Rings of Power, in the new Amazon series, you start to get a sense of why this is. The way that it was made and what was put into it give it this power. And honestly, the evil that comes from Sauron in the creation of the ring characterizes the ring.
Hmm.
And this might be one of the bigger differences between the movie and the books is you don't get a sense really in the movies of the will of the ring. You get the
Right.
sense of all the people who want the ring, and you do
Hmm.
get a sense that the ring corrupts because whenever somebody has it is a corrupting influence. But in the books, you really get a sense that the ring itself is a character. It has a will, it is working out its will in the world. There's a really powerful scene when Gandalf is first telling Frodo about the ring in the Shire. He talks about it this way. He says, "A ring of power looks after itself, Frodo. It may slip off treacherously, but its keeper never abandons it. It was not Gollum, Frodo, but the ring itself that decided things. The ring left him. There is more than one power at work, Frodo. The ring was trying to get back to its master. It had slipped from Isildur's hand and betrayed him. Then, when a chance came, it caught poor Deagle and he was murdered. And after that, Gollum, and it had devoured
Hmm.
him. It could make no further use of him. He was too small and mean, and as long as it stayed with him, he would never leave his deep pool again. So now, when its master was awake once more and sending out his dark thought from Mirkwood, it abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo from the Shire. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the ring maker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, in which case you were meant to have it. And that may be an encouraging thought.
Mm. Very powerful. That's an interesting theme that I know we're going to touch on in the next episode is that idea that there is good and evil, but there's something else going on. And this idea of perhaps with everybody's free will operating here, including the ring's free will, perhaps you were meant to find this, that there's actually a design running through what's happening here, which of course I find to be a very Christian theme, but that is a unique idea and it's a very deep idea. It's not, he gives you the sense that it's not just the will of Sauron or the will of Gandalf or the will of all, the various antagonists in the story, that there's actually something else, a guiding hand that you never see.
Hmm.
And the word, for that's coined for that is this idea of a eucatastrophe, a catastrophe that turns out for good. And I know we'll talk about that next time, but you really see that when Gandalf is talking about the ring.
Yeah, the ring has a will of its own. It's a corrupting will. It wants to get back to its master. It wants to use people. And this is at the heart of the power theme of the Lord of the Rings. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, is the phrase that we use. And this would have been a phrase that Tolkien knew, and he's portraying this in the ring. The ring is a corrupting power, to have that much power. And you see the wise characters distance themselves. Gandalf, Galadriel, Elrond, they don't want the ring because they understand the corrupting power of the ring. But Gandalf, more than others, seems to sense that there is another will in the universe, that there is a will for evil and there is a will for good. And that the will for good, although more subtle, and it's
Hmm.
not as overt at any point in The Lord of the Rings as Sauron is actually more powerful in the end. That there's a divine ordination of the quest that these characters are going on. Not that it's ensured. You never get the sense that this is ensured to work out. Tolkien is a great writer in the sense that there's never an inevitability that they're going to be able to destroy the ring. The odds always look against them the entire time, which leads you to that eucatastrophe theme that we'll pick up next time. There's no inevitability that's going to happen, but there is something else, fate, the divine ordination behind the
Hmm.
quest that keeps it moving ever slowly towards its goal.
The idea of luck, chance, all of those things coming together are not shallow in this book. It's not like when you just read a regular novel and there's some great coincidence that happens and it sort of resolves all the ends. Here, that is just a hint of something bigger that's really moving through this story. That chance
Hmm.
isn't really chance, and catastrophes aren't really catastrophes. And perhaps the unlikeliest characters of all, the hobbits, have always had a key role in this. You really get a deeper sense of something moving in this. And evil is up front in this book. I mean, you clearly have Sauron, you have conquest, you have evil. And I think that's the way Tolkien saw the world, particularly through the war, is that evil is very apparent. But good is far more subtle in the way it works. And I really see that come through The Lord of the Rings. Like you said, it's if you just look at it on its face, it looks like Sauron's going to win. In World War II, it looked like Hitler was going to win. And yet there's this subtle but very powerful force that ends up overcoming.
That's where we'll leave our characters in this episode is on the brink of disaster, but a glimmer of hope. And as we head into World War II in Tolkien's life, and as the characters broken apart from the Fellowship head towards Mount Doom, we'll wrap up our series with the theme of eucatastrophe. We'll talk about what happens to the ring in the end.